Hello, welcome everyone to today's session at the Delhi Book Fair. The topic of today's session is Kashmir Ke Agha, Pain, Poetry and a Journey, which I'll be discussing with Manan Kapoor.
So, a short description for Sarah. Sarah is an engineer and a lawyer. She's practicing primarily at the Supreme Court of India. She runs her own law firm, which is based in Delhi. Formerly junior to Mr. Dushyant Dave, senior advocate, she has a keen interest in constitutional and human rights cases, even though a majority of her work is in the commercial space. She is also authoring a book on the landmark Babri Masjid case, of which she was a part when it was before the Honorable Supreme Court of India. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I also welcome Mr. Manan Kapoor, who is an Indian writer and a translator. A Map of Longings, the life and works of Agha Shahid Ali is his latest work. His debut novel was actually shortlisted for the Sahitya Academy's Yuva Puraskar in 2017. And in 2019, he was a writer in residence at the Sangam House Writers Residency. His writings have appeared in the Caravan magazine, Boston Review, The Hindu, to name a few. And today's talk would be centered around the Kashmiri American poet Agha Shahid Ali. It is my personal opinion that no talk on Kashmir and its contemporary history could begin without a reference to how it is viewed by the people of the land. So before I, hand it over to Manan, I would like to highlight the text of the Instrument of Accession, which was executed by Maharaja Hari Singh and accepted by Lord Mountbatten. In some specific references to, say, Clause 5, which said in so many terms that the instrument should not be altered, to Clause 7, which said that in no way is this instrument deemed to commit in any way an acceptance of a future constitution, or Clause 8, where there is a specific reference to Kashmir retaining its sovereignty. So, Manan, I and I'm sure everyone who's tuned in would like to know why Ali's work, the country without a post office. He specifically, does he refer to Kashmir as a country? Is he sort of going back to the sovereignty which was envisaged to be a part of the Instrument of Accession?
Great. Thank you so much for the question, Sarah. And thank you for the lovely introduction. So, I mean, one thing that I'd like to point out, like before we start with this, is the collection and even the poem that the title poem from the collection was initially called Kashmir Without a Post Office. And later it was changed, Shahid changed it to The Country Without a Post Office. And yes, Shahid was aware of the political history of Kashmir. And so naturally his poetry was politically informed as well. But one thing I'd like to point out is, and it's a very important thing here, that people are a lot of times confuse the two terms, nation and country, and they're not really synonymous. And Shahid's idea was country, which is closer to desh rather than rashtra, which is the idea of a nation state. And I think the term country is more of a cultural idea than a nation or a nation state, which is more political. It is about the homeland and what it entails. And I think, Shahid was very aware of these things, and his poetry was politically informed. If you pick up the collection, The Country Without a Post Office, it talks about the suffering of the Kashmiri people and the loss and the pain that the people were, going through, especially in the 90s when he was writing. And so Shahid was, as I said, he was aware of the political history, and he even once said that, and this was sometime in the late 90s, that someone had asked him, what do you think the solution for Kashmir should be? And he said that it would be autonomy within the Indian Union in the broadest sense. But he had a long list of caveats and reservations about it. And, but in the end, he, I think, said that no such solution was possible anymore for Kashmir, that it was almost impossible to think of a solution. And in so many ways, I think Shahid's gaze was political in the sense of like how he viewed the world around him with the human encounters and their idea and their relationship with history and the political situation and the political surroundings, but not so much when it comes to policy or collection like Country Without a Post Office, I think it has so much more to do with the suffering of the people and all that they went through, during their day-to-day life and their lived experiences. And it talks so much more about that. So, yeah, that's, I think, yeah.
Yeah, in fact, you say that, as Kashmir was cut off from the whole world, Shahid was summoned to speak for those who were silenced.
Right,
When Article 370 was abrogated and, it was stripped of its autonomy, all landlines and cellular internet services were shut down, and, the
right,
restrictions imposed were essentially
right,
curfew-like. So, certainly that makes sense. So in your book, your book begins with the story of Shahid's influential, culturally inclined, parents, Sufia and Ashraf, who gave,
right.
all of their children a multicultural childhood. And, you say that a handful of definers couldn't possibly decrypt who Shahid was, an artist or a personality. So what do you have
Right.
to say on that?
Um, I mean, the most important thing I think here to look at is that when you're talking to different people who knew, and I think in a way each one of us has a kaleidoscopic personality, but then I think when you're talking about a poet or a writer or an artist or a musician, I think that they have their personal concerns and then their poetic concerns in case of Shahid. And so I think when you look at someone like Shahid and you really start to inquire about his life, who he was, his ideas, and at the same time you're looking at what he wrote, and so there is this person that comes up, which and this personality which is separate from the self, which is almost as if there are these poetic concerns which are important to Shahid the poet, but those concerns might not be important to Shahid the person, and vice versa, because there were so many things in his life, which I think he cared about as a person, as a human being, but they never found their way into his poetry. So when you're looking at a subject who's an artist or a writer or a poet, I think there is this clear separation in some cases, whereas maybe in others it's not. But again, I mean, it's something that I think I've tried to explore through the book, where I've tried to give an idea of who Shahid was as a person and what parts of his personal lives have informed his poetry. The cultural upbringing at his home, what parts, what instances or what stories and anecdotes that he responded to, which he grew up with, which he remembered when he was years later writing his poems. And so when you, for instance, take a look at his engagement with Christ, which continues from his very first collection, which came out in the early 70s, up until his last collection, Rooms Are Never Finished. There is the presence of Christ throughout, and that was something he picked up as a kid when he was about 8 or 9 years old. The first poem that he ever wrote was, in fact, about Christ, and it was called The Man. So I think there are these poetic concerns which he retained, and I think that is what led to Shahid. The statement where I say that there was a difference between the person and the poet, and to look at both of them at the same time would be a very, it would be almost an impossible task. And so it's really a question of what aspect of their life do you want to really explore. And I responded to Shahid's poetry and his poetic vision, what he wrote, how he wrote what he wrote, and like the whole process of writing poetry, and how he engaged with all these forms, and which I'm sure we'll get later, we'll get on to
We'll
later.
come to
But
that.
there is that was my main concern, and that's what I've basically tried to explore through this biography. Yeah.
Can you actually give us an example, of an important aspect of his personality which did not actually translate to his poetry?
So Shahid's sexuality was one of them. So as you might know, as many people might know, Shahid was gay, but he very clearly stated that it wasn't one of his poetic concerns, that he wasn't really interested in his sexuality enough to
He never wanted to be
sort of.
labeled as a gay poet, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, that was another thing. But to begin with, he was never interested in his sexual life. and his personal private matters, that they never found their way into the poems. And sure, there are some instances where he talks about love, and he leaves he made a conscious decision, which I think comes from his reading of W.H. Auden, the American poet, where he says that um, Auden chose to use the term you instead of he or she, because he couldn't use she and he didn't want to use he. So he left the pronoun ambiguous and would use you. And I think that's the case with Shahid as well. When you look at so many of his poems, there is always this you. And so there is this ambiguous beloved lover relationship. And um, I think that's actually quite a beautiful thing, because he's left it quite open for interpretation. And I think that's what poetry does best. It reaches out to so many people in so many different ways. And I'm sure everyone reads a poem differently and they have their own interpretations. But I think that is one of the most important things that about his personal life that I think didn't make its way into his poetry or his poetic concerns, as I talk about in the book.
Correct, correct, that's correct, that's correct. Okay, so moving on to all that he's done with Faiz Ahmad Faiz and Darwish. So essentially, Faiz had stayed at Shahid's house in Srinagar before the partition,
Right.
and it was actually a rare Begum Akhtar tape recording that had brought the two together. And he essentially wrote to him in 1982 to seek permission to translate his poems. And at that time, Faiz was exiled, but within a month he had replied that you're welcome to do whatever you want with my poems, but send me the tape.
Right, right.
So,
It was almost like a bribe, yeah.
yeah, yeah, correct. So and what's also interesting, once you read one reads your book, to know that Shahid actually spent like an entire night perfecting, his translations of just a single line of Faiz's poetry. So, my question to you is, was it Shahid's early affinity to the Urdu poetry, which led him to translate Faiz Ahmad Faiz, or was there more to it?
I mean, definitely his upbringing had a massive impact on his reading affairs. He stated that when he was a child, when he was a young boy, I think his father used to sing Faiz, so he'd internalized the ghazals and nazms of Faiz in his father's voice. And he was exposed to all these different poets. And Faiz was, I think, one of the most important poets in the fact that he had come over to Shahid's house and stayed there. And so Shahid was very aware of poets like Faiz Ahmad Faiz. And naturally, when he moved to Delhi and, he came in contact with Begum Akhtar, I think that that really led him closer to Faiz in so many ways, because Begum Akhtar would sing Faiz so often, and Shahid was there, and I'm sure they discussed Faiz and Faiz's poetry. And but it was really when he moved to the United States in 1975 that he really started engaging with Faiz, because that's when he came to realize that there was this very important poet from this part of the world, from the Indian subcontinent, and who was respected by both the masses and the critics, and who was really an important poet for Shahid personally as well. But no one in America knew about Faiz Ahmad Faiz, and he was baffled. And I think after one point he decided, well, no one knows about Faiz, so let me introduce Faiz to them. And so I think the idea of translation for Shahid was also, the reason was also in a way to sort of familiarize the American audience with a poet like Faiz Ahmad Faiz. And yes, there had been a few translations before. Victor Kiernan had translated Faiz's poetry, but Shahid felt that Kiernan lacked. In Kiernan's translations, Kiernan failed to capture Faiz's emotional excitement. That was his major concern, major problem with the translations of Kiernan. And I think at the same time in 1980s, he came in touch with Naomi Lazard, who he then got to know was also translating Faiz. And they exchanged a few letters and discussed Faiz's poetry. And after, I think Shahid spent about a decade working on Faiz's translations. So it was really a big task that he'd taken up, and he really wanted to do it perfectly. And I think the reasons were that he wanted to introduce Faiz to the American audience. And this is something he's talked about a lot of times in a lot of lectures, even in the introduction to the Rebel Silhouette, where he says that he was furious, almost furious when he came to the US because no one really seemed to know what Fez. So I think it was both, the lack of Fez's presence in America and the fact that he was so far away. And I think translating Fez for the American audience, because his translation was primarily done for the American, keeping in mind the American audience. And so I think that was a way of introducing Fez, but also remembering a poet who he admired and loved. But Shahid also took away so much more from Fez, because I think the process of translation helped him, imbibe the metaphors and of Urdu poetry into his English, which was subcontinental in so many ways. And so I think it was really a question of all that he gained from Fez. Yeah.
In fact, he'd written a piece on the true subject, paper which got
Right.
published in Grand Street. Why don't you tell us a
Right.
little about that as well?
So that was a review of Naomi Lazard's translations. The true subject was the title of Naomi Lazard's translations of Fez, and Shahid, I think, was the first person to review it, and he wrote it for Columbia. And no, I'm sorry, for Grand Street, if I'm not
Grand
wrong.
Street.
In
Published in
Grand
Grand.
Street, yeah, published in Grand Street. And that's where he really, I think, for the first time, talks about Fez in a proper fashion, where he introduces Fez, his relationship with Fez. And I think he ends the essay saying that Naomi Lazard has done a brave and lonely work, because Lazard was someone who, although Shahid felt that her translations were really, really good, he felt that it was the same thing, that for someone who was not used to or didn't know Urdu as they couldn't really translate a poet like Fez, because in
A lot is
Urdu
lost in
poetry,
translation.
for instance, in Urdu poetry, tera dard can mean two things at the same time: the pain that, or the sorrow that you've caused, or the sorrow that you feel. So there is this duality of meaning in Urdu poetry. So maybe in a couplet, it can mean two things at once. And I feel that, well, while Shahid recognized that, because he grew up hearing Fez's verses, and it wasn't the case with Lazard or maybe Kiernan. So he had his, he had more meaning to add to those translations, which later appeared in the early 90s. But I think that was the first time Shahid really sat down and talked about Fez so openly. And I think that was also coincidentally the year that Fez died in 1984, when this essay was published. So I think the timing was almost as if he was announcing his translations. And so that was, I think, one of the
True. So before we move on to Ali's American phase, which is where we are sort of right now, I would go back to his relationship with Begum Akhtar, and all that he'd learned from her.
Right.
In the sense that essentially about his intense relationship with Begum Akhtar, to the point that her death in 1974 sort of brought an end to his the Delhi chapter of his life. The
Right.
book talks about how he learned the nuances of Urdu's musical quality through her singing. It is very rare for a poet to actually study the poetic craft behind someone's singing.
Right.
So can you talk about his relationship with her? And so we were basically talking about his relationship with Begum Akhtar, and how that's
right. So Begum Akhtar, she played a massive role in Shahid's life, and she, as I said, she appears in almost all of his collections, and I think she was someone who was really special to him, and he grew up listening to her ghazals, and then when he moved to Delhi, that's when he really meets Begum Akhtar for the first time, and then when along with his friend Salim Kadwai, who sadly just passed away, I think last week. Both of them would go there and they would listen to Begum Akhtar and they would spend time with her. And in fact, there's a Doordarshan recording of Begum Akhtar singing a Fez ghazal, and Shahid is right there in the front. So I think the relationship that they had, and how Shahid he described it, it was that he really loved to be around her, and her presence had a massive impact on her in terms of all that he gained from her as he did from Fez, because Begum Akhtar, there's a very famous, anecdote about Begum Akhtar that Shahid would often, talk about in his class. The fact, so one time, and this was, I think, in the 70s when Indira Gandhi was the prime minister, and the poet Kaifi Azmi came to Begum Akhtar in Delhi one evening and showed her a couplet that he'd written, and it said something like, "Oh, it's back." Um, so it said something like, "The mad lover was once again sighted in your street." And Begum Akhtar instantly recognized the political power of that couplet and said, "Well, someone should go and recite that to Indira Gandhi," because she instantly, correlated the idea of revolution to the mad lover in the streets. And Shahid would often narrate this, and this is one of the things that I think he gained from her, the power to recognize, uh, this something really special in the banal, in the mundane, and in these basic concepts. And in a lot of ways, the idea of mad lover, the lover, turning into revolution was an idea that Faiz had obviously introduced through his poetry. But in fact, when one looks at Shahid's contribution to the ghazal in English, I think, and the lyric capacity of his poetry, a lot of that comes from Begum Akhtar. He would, in fact, sit and listen to her ghazals, the refrain and what the refrain and the repetition did in terms of how the listeners were moved by a repetition of the refrain of a ghazal. And I think that is something that he really incorporated in his poetry. So, and I mean, there was Begum Akhtar, but there were so many other people that he did this with as well. He would sit down, listen to those poets, listen to, and in a lot of ways, I think the orality of poetry was something that he was very interested in, the lyric capacity of poetry. And I think she was a person who played a major role. And I mean, there's a wonderful moment in his poem Snow on the Desert where he's driving through the fog, and he's trying to think of a moment to compare this moment to, except he couldn't find one. And so he comes to the conclusion that he can only compare these, two incomparable moments. And then he thinks of Begum Akhtar back in Delhi singing a Faiz ghazal. And so he evokes her again, and he did that so many times throughout his poems, be it Rooms Are Never Finished, Country, or Half in Himalayas. I mean, it's just the relationship that they had was so wonderful and so unique, and yeah, he gained a lot from her. Yeah.
Yeah, now that you mentioned Snow on the Desert, these lines, a time to think of everything, the earth, and I had lost of all that I would lose, of all that I was losing. I mean, these were essentially
Right.
at the time of the Bangladesh Liberation War, right? But
Right. Right.
but it's still sort of relevant to the situation that we see is also in the present day Kashmir, in the sense
Right.
that there are people were cut off for over a year, and we did
Right.
not know what's happening on ground.
Right.
And even now, there are reports of mental health issues, post-traumatic stress disorders and
Right.
everything. So uh, you know is that essentially why you think that Shahids should essentially flood the internet with what's going on in Kashmir, which is so
Right.
unfortunate?
Right. No, I mean, I remember in 2019, early in August, when the Article 370 was abrogated by the
Fifth
Indian
of
state. And I remember, going to meet a couple of friends in Delhi who were from Kashmir, and I went and spoke to them, and almost all of them said, it's a very sad situation, but Shahid's poetry is still so relevant because in so many ways it's still so true. It's still um, I think a lot of writers and poets have come forward claiming that Shahid was the first poet, and poets and writers from Kashmir. They've come forward saying that Shahid was the first poet who made sense to them of the world around them, right? And through his works, they could see their own world. And I think it's a really sad situation that a country like a collection like The Country Without a Post Office is still so relevant that, it's just, I mean, people often like go back to it, and it still makes sense to them. But it's just I think there is so much more that, and I mean, naturally, like then that becomes the focus whenever Shahid is spoken of, he's talked about, and naturally that should be there. I mean, that's a massive part of his legacy and all that he's left behind, and all that he's done for Kashmiri literature and Kashmiri poetry, and for the young poets especially. I remember speaking to so many young poets from Kashmir, and they really look up to Shahid, and they really revere him. And a lot of times they say that the reason we started writing poetry was because we read Shahid's poems, and we felt that we too could, sort of express our experiences, our day-to-day life, and all that we go through, and our suffering, our pain, through poetry. And so, in a lot of ways, Shahid is still very relevant when it comes to Kashmir and what's going on in there. And because if you read a couple of lines, I mean, I remember I wrote a piece for the Boston Review, and that was me trying to sort of understand what's going on in Kashmir, but through Shahid's poetry, because I remember picking up The Country Without a Post Office that month in, I think, early 4th or 5th August, if I remember correctly. I think that was the date. And I mean, what I was reading in all these newspapers and Hindu and this and that, all the reports that were coming out of Kashmir, which it all just took me back to Shahid and his poetry. So it's such an unfortunate situation that the collection is still very relevant, but that's there. Yeah.
I think let's move on to a slightly lighter topic now.
Right.
Essentially, after he reached America, in his own words, he says that he grew as a poet. So was it,
Right.
his friendship with James Merrill, or was there more to it? Was it, the difference between India and USA in terms of, the culture or the literary exposure?
Right. I think there were a lot of factors which could sort of went into that statement that he made, that he grew as a lover, as a poet. One definitely was maturity in age and experience, right? Because he was a professor at Hindu in India, and his biggest complaint with the 70s wasn't like a very good time for an English poet in India. And he, I think, knew from experience, because he lived in the US when his father was there to get his PhD for about 3 years, I think. And he knew from experience all that America could offer to him. And he considered English his first language. And in so many ways it was. Although there were other languages that he spoke and, read poetry in, and all those poets, but English was the language he spoke. And I think when he moved to the US, when he finally moves to the US, a lot of things that I think he was aware of became much clearer because of the distance. So when you look at a collection like the Half Inch Himalayas, it's almost as if all those concerns that, all those, the things that he probably wanted to express through his poetry become almost crystallized once he moves to the US. So, and naturally, he discovered so many new poets. So he was obviously reading the poetry of Eliot, and he in fact taught Eliot and Plath and, all the other poets at Hindu. But then he also discovers poets like W.S. Merwin, James Merrill, and so many other great American poets. And I mean, that definitely expanded his universe, and all that he perceived and all that he was responding to. So in a lot of ways, I think the move to America was a very pragmatic move for him, because I think that's where he saw his future, where he thought that he could actually grow as a poet, as opposed to living in India, where there was still no space for, I wouldn't say still no space, but very limited space for an English language poet. And I think that the time he spent at Penn State, I think that was roughly 8 years, and the people he met, maybe the conversations that he had, and then finally when he moves to, I think, Arizona in the early 80s, all of those experiences, and I think for the first time he was living on his own, he was away, and so he started realizing a lot of things, and about the idea of home, what it is to be away from home. Because I think in one of his letters of one of the essays, he's written something like, at night, I would think about Kashmir. And in so many ways, I see all of that in the Harpanch Himalayas, where all of that sort of like manifests. So, and you can see the presence of both the Indian subcontinent as well as his, stay in America and all that he learned. So I think, yeah, it's true that he grew a lot in when he moved to the US, and I personally, I think it was a very practical, a very sensible move for someone like Shahid. And yeah, I think that's pretty much like because that really led to so many different things. I mean, if he, I think, I personally think if he'd never moved to the US, he would have never ended up translating Fez. He would have never, I think, experimented with the ghazal in English language. Maybe he would, it would have come back, but not transformed in the way that he did. So it did a lot for him as well. So yeah.
So would you go so far as to draw a parallel between, Faiz Ahmad Faiz's time in the prison to his time in America away from home? Would you sort of draw an analogy to that?
Not really. I mean,
Or would
I
that
think that's a
be
little,
too
little, yeah,
simplistic
yeah,
of
yeah. No,
you?
because in so many ways, Shai, I mean, in so many interviews and so many places, he'd said that, I moved to the US, and yes, I'm not like, he wasn't. I'm sure he wasn't earning a lot of money during the first 8 years when he was, doing his PhD and then like teaching, but he was quite happy there. He'd in fact said that the Penn State years were actually like the happiest time of his life. I, I mean, so I mean, it wasn't really a prison for him, and I mean, I think that was the poet in him speaking when a lot of times, he used the term exile, and I think he'd once said that I'm in a state of self-imposed exile. So, but it was self-imposed in so many ways because I think he wanted to evoke all of that, the feeling, the exilic feeling that comes with the term, and it was almost sort of a response. And I'm sure he was reading like other poets in exile. So that was something just like what you call poet speak, right? But Shahid was very happy there. He was growing, he was learning. He was always cooking when he was at Penn State, and a lot of his friends just remember, like we would go to Shahid's play, like his studio at Penn State, and each night he would be cooking something, and there would be people, there would be music. So it was always like a very the environment was always very. I mean, he was quite happy there.
It was
So
lively.
I mean, to compare it to a prison would just be like wrong. No, yeah,
Yeah, that'd be
yeah, It was in
correct.
fact the opposite, I
Okay.
think. Yeah.
Correct. So moving on now, to we're sort of nearing the end of the session. So before we wrap up, to one of the most important aspects, essentially his politics and his position as a
Right.
poet of witness. In fact, you yourself say in one of your interviews that for such a poet, history does not represent the idea of truth, but of human encounters. And for a
Right.
poet to respond to conflicts in history that are political, it is the meaning and fate of human life caught in that violent encounter which is of
Right.
primary importance. Right. So can you elaborate on his politics, his position
Right.
as a poet, as a person, as a public personality?
Right. No, I must correct you. That was something that the poet and scholar Manas Bhattacharya wrote
Cool.
about the
Fair
book.
enough.
But I mean, no, I agree with him. I completely agree with the idea. And I mean, Shahid was, I mean, a lot of people say, okay, Shahid was a political poet. But then I say, okay, what poet is not political if you look at it? Because, poetry is a political act. I mean, there's this one quote by, I think, Yehuda Amikai, where he says that. Even the notion of sitting in a glass house drinking tea reflects a certain politics, right? And I think that's very true. But and Shahid, I think, was more of a like poet of injustice or a poet of witness, and like Paul Celan, because when you look at a collection like a nostalgist map of America, you see all of these different places that he's visiting on his drive from Arizona to Penn State, I'm sorry, to Hamilton. And so he talks about all these different cultures, these different like injustices that had happened in the past, like the Bisbee deportation of 1917, where um, I think a lot of men were put in boxcars and sent away to mining camps in the US, and no one really likes to talk about that event. But Shahid did. He became aware of it, Then he talks about, I mean, even when in a poem like Eurydice, where he's talking about the idea of injustice, he places her in a Nazi camp. So he's trying to explore so many different things through his poetry. And naturally, like when you come to the 90s and he starts writing about Kashmir, there is obviously like the idea of injustice and, the poet taking the position of a witness. So that's there. But Shahid had once very clearly stated that, and I think he'd said this said this to one of his students, that if you're you're a person who's from a difficult place, and that's the only thing that you can write about, then you're not really a writer, because he really thought he should, poets and writers and artists in general should like explore all the possibilities, all the ideas, and not just to write about like that was the primary thing that he really, I think, focused on. And in so many of his poems you can actually see that strain of as the poet as a witness, but not just like it was never just limited to Kashmir, but he would talk about so much else. So I think that was one of the things that I really appreciate about Shahid, the fact that you know wherever he went, he would see all those things and respond to them in a way. And I think this one time, so this one time Shahid sent a poem to the poet James Merrill, and the poem was about Bosnia in the 90s. Um, and Merrill wrote back saying, "Well, there's nothing that you can do about Bosnia, but at least you can write a good poem." So and then I think slowly Shah had learned about like all of this, and he came to realize that um, the what do you call it? I'm sorry. The aesthetic value was as important as the political value of the poem. The aesthetic was as important as the political aspect of what you were talking about, or the political subject matter. And I think that was something that he really struck by. And I think the fact that a collection like The Country Without a Post Office is so, um, you know, people really look up to it even today, is because of all the different forms that Shahid used. Of the aesthetic beauty of the collection plays a major role. There are, I think, about 5 or 6 forms that Shahid uses in the collection: a ghazal, a villanelle, a canzone, this and that. So, I mean, that was what really made his poems really unique. And I think he once said something on the lines of that. He'd, I think, asked a student who'd come to him with the poem on the Holocaust and said, well, do you think all poems about Holocaust are the same? No, there is like, there are poems that he considered good, and then there were poems which needed, work. But I think he was, yes, he was a political poet in so many ways, but he'd said that he didn't think of him as one. Because I mean, when you're talking about political poets, you're talking about people like Darwish, you're talking about people like Mandelstam, but even Darwish talks about love, the idea of love, and there is likeness in his works as well. So, and again, I mean, what I started off with, I'll come back to that again. What poet is not political? So, Shahid's poems were, yeah, they were political, but yeah, his politics was there. And he'd been taught that from a young age. So whether he was a poet or not, I think he would have retained that strain in him to talk about injustice, to talk about all of these things, because his father would talk about the Rosenbergs and their execution by the U.S. government. And he'd said that, from a very young age, I had responded to that. So whether or not he'd, become a poet, whether he was an art, whether he was a visual artist, something else, I think that would have remained with him. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that old adage, beauty lies in the eyes of the beholder. I think that equally applies everywhere. There is no absolute truth, and especially when it comes to poetry or art in general, right? I mean, it's essentially what the person who's reading and comprehending in that moment. Everyone has their own version of it. So in that sense, yeah, I think it would be very limited. It would be actually an injustice to limit him to just a political poet. I think same goes for his Faiz Ahmed Faiz as well, in that sense. Correct. So more often than not, you've said that your intention behind writing this biography was to sort of immortalize his life in a way,
Right.
you know, and and there's of course a lot more to the biography. Like we learn of his humor, we learn of his desire to be the life and soul of every gathering. Like you talked about food, right? So his mastery of the cuisine, and his
Right.
just in general his witty personality. So anything else that you would yourself, without me asking a question, would like to talk about from the book?
Um, I mean, I think we can talk about Shahid's humor, and that a lot of people like. I think over the past few months have come to me and they're like, "Oh, he was so funny," and that's it. But no, it had it had so much to do with like the idea of wordplay. That I mean, when you look at the anecdote, and it's one of the most famous anecdotes that is recalled when people are talking about Shahid, is that there was one time he was at Barcelona airport, and the woman at the security asked him, "Are you carrying anything dangerous?" And he put his hand to his chest and said, "Only my heart." And I think that says so much about him, because he
True.
was trying to look for poetry in the banal, in the everyday life, and often it would come with the his wit and humor, and especially that collection, A Walk Through the Yellow Pages, where he talks about so many different things, like responding to the Bell telephone are ads. Like, I mean, AT&T used to be Bell telephone, and they had these big advertisements, and one of them was reach out and touch someone far away, and Shahid thought that it was hilarious. So at the end, he he ended up responding to those advertisements, and so he was trying to look for poetry in like all of these different spaces and places, and in conversations, and so many of his poems, and the lines, and the famous line, "Your history gets in the way of my memory," and like the other way around, and he plays with that line in his poem Farewell. Actually comes from a conversation between, his friend was speaking on the phone, and he just picked that line up, and in so many ways he used that line in his poem Farewell, and he really made it work. So I think it's the humor and the charm and the wit wasn't just limited to him as a person, but it really made its way into his poetry, and especially his ghazals, where you really see what he's trying to do, and that's when it really comes through. And I think that is one of the most important aspects of his. Yeah.
Hello,
Okay.
guys.
Yeah. Hi.
Hi.
Sarah,
Have we
Manan, how
we've
are you
overstretched
guys?
the time, I suppose.
Lovely session.
Oh, I'm sorry. Was I didn't see. Oh, I'm so sorry.
Hi, lovely session. I just want to thank all of you for day one, and I hope you enjoyed your session, and it was very fascinating to watch you guys speak.
Right. Thank you so
Thank you.
much.
Yeah, I
Thank
had
you.
a lovely
Thank
time.
you.
Okay,
Thank you.
well, thank you so much. And any closing remarks, both of you?
Sarah, if you,
Well, I just
but
encourage everyone to get a copy of this book. That should essentially be my last.
thank you so much, and thank you for the lovely questions. Thank you.